So, the Las Vegas Raiders are moving in the right direction with plenty of options. As we move past Super Bowl week and the 2024 season officially comes to a close, all eyes are on the start of free agency. The Raiders are in a unique position right now, with plenty of cap space and flexibility. They have 27 players set to hit free agency and roughly $100 million to work with. They have added a new assistant to the coaching staff and looking for options to build an elite roster. What's up, buddies? Welcome back. If you are new here, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We cover all AFC West news here on this channel. One of the biggest headlines of the day came from the New York Jets official Twitter account. They announced that they've informed Aaron Rodgers they'll be moving in a different direction. Naturally, this sparked plenty of conversation online, especially about whether the Raiders should consider making Rodgers. It's an interesting debate. The Raiders could go all in for the next 3 to 4 years while they still have Pete Carroll, or they could take a more long-term approach, drafting and developing quarterback. Nick Shook of NFL Media put together a list of the top 4 potential landing spots for Rodgers, and unsurprisingly, the Raiders were the first team on it. He wrote, "This pairing actually makes sense for a few reasons. Tom Brady's minority ownership seems to carry a ton of influence over the organization, and it wouldn't be a surprise if he pushed the Raiders to pursue a fellow legend who, like Brady, needed a new home to finish out his career. The Raiders have a new regime led by Pete Carroll with zero connection to Aiden O'Connell, clearing a path for them to pursue a new signal caller. But because they won their way out of a top 5 pick, it's less certain they'll land one in this draft than it was in early December. Why not add a bridge in Rodgers for a 1-year stint to protect against the situation they found themselves in last season? Sure, it'll attract attention, but the Raiders have never been a shy franchise. Plus, it'll likely go better than that 1-year trial went with Matt Shaw back in 2014. The other 3 teams he listed, the Giants, Browns, and Steelers, in that order. When the reports of Rodgers and the Jets splitting were swirling earlier this week, there were odds already being put out. The Raiders were number 2 on that list behind the Steelers. There are plenty of opinions, but on the field, he has proven he can still play at a high level. This past season, he threw for nearly 4,000 yards with 28 touchdowns and 11 interceptions. Keep in mind, he was coming off a serious injury, which cost him an entire season. Even with that, his numbers were solid, and he actually got better as the season progressed. Looking at the Jets, they ended up a disappointing season, and while they had issues, Rodgers wasn't one of them. Their biggest struggles stemmed from moving on from Robert Saleh and lacking a strong offensive coaching staff. Now, for the Raiders, bringing in Rodgers could be financially feasible if structured correctly. Let that sink. If structured correctly. Let's break down the numbers. Aaron Rodgers will be free to sign with any team once free agency begins, but the financial hit for the Jets won't take effect until after June 1st. By cutting Rodgers, the Jets will absorb a $49 million cap hit, with $14 million impacting 2025 and $35 million hitting in 2026. This brings up a big question. Should the Raiders even be interested in Aaron Rodgers? There are 2 ways this could play out. Option 1, trade for Rodgers. Now, the Jets have already announced their plan to release him, but that doesn't mean a trade is completely off the table. It's experienced in the past that teams first release a player, then manage to find a trade partner at the last second. Remember when the Raiders were reportedly set to release Gabe Jackson and Rodney Hudson, but instead, both were traded? That scenario could technically still happen with Rodgers. If the Raiders wanted to trade for him, they'd take on a $9.5 million cap hit, but still owe him $37.5 million in cash. That's a steep price tag. But because the Jets are moving on from him anyway, so he could be available for a bargain, but not so fast. The reality is, for the Jets to consider trading Rodgers, the Raiders would have to offer a legitimate draft pick, and that too for a high-caliber selection. Because if the Jets trade him, they take a $25.5 million cap loss and still eat $49 million in 2025. If they just cut him post-June 1st, they save $9.5 million. That's why a late-round pick in 2026 isn't going to cut it. For that reason, the idea of trading for Rodgers makes 0 sense for the Raiders, and the Jets won't do it either. That brings us to the second option, signing Rodgers after he's cut. Here's the deal. If the Raiders are going to bring in Rodgers, the only way it makes sense is if he signs a veteran minimum contract for $1.2 million, just like Russell Wilson did with Pittsburgh. But the difference in contracts is huge. Wilson was still receiving money from the Broncos, which allowed him to take the minimum elsewhere. That's not the case for Rodgers. According to an NFL insider, Aaron Rodgers won't be getting any of his remaining $37.5 million from the Jets once they cut him. If he were, then sure, he might for cheap. But since he won't, it's difficult to see him signing for $1.2 million. However, if Rodgers really wants to prove that he's about the team and not just himself, signing for the minimum would show it. That kind of move could make a lot of sense for the Raiders. Now, some might argue that the Raiders should stick with a defensive identity, but they have a lot of free agents on that side of the ball. Players like Nate Hobbs, Trayvon Moehrig, Isaiah Polamau, and Marcus Epps are all set to hit free agency. Both starting linebackers, Robert Spillane and Divine Diablo, are pending free agents, along with key defensive linemen. The Raiders could opt to let some of these players walk and instead invest in offense. Instead of spending big money on defensive players, they could allocate those funds toward acquiring weapons and bringing in Rodgers. Now, let's talk about Max Crosby's opinion on Rodgers' inclusion in the Raiders. There's been a lot of buzz about his comments. So, does Crosby want Rodgers on the Raiders? He did mention Rodgers during his podcast, saying, "I would get Rodgers, why not?" But here's the context. Crosby wasn't talking about the Raiders. He was talking about the Vikings. He even said, send him to Minnesota if they don't bring back Sam Darnold. He was imagining Rodgers playing with Kevin O'Connell, Justin Jefferson, and Jordan Addison. If Crosby truly wanted Rodgers in Vegas, he would have said so directly. Instead, he mentioned Minnesota, which tells that this wasn't a pitch for the Raiders to go after. Another factor that goes against opting Rodgers is that the Jets now need a quarterback, and that creates more competition for the Raiders. Whether it's free agency, trade, or the draft, the Jets are officially in the mark quarterback. That makes it even more important for the Raiders to secure a starter in free agency for the draft, where quarterback competition will be fierce. And speaking of the draft, the Jets have the number 7th overall pick, right behind the Raiders at number 6. Could they move up to grab a quarterback? A name to watch is Shedeur Sanders. The Jets are a franchise that values marketability, and bringing in a high-profile quarterback like Sanders makes sense for them. If they decide to make a move, it could throw a wrench into the Raiders' draft plan. So, the Jets cutting Rodgers affects free agency, trade opportunities, and the draft. Aside from Rodgers, another name that surfaced is Matthew Stafford. Colin Cowherd, who has strong connections in Los Angeles, reported that the Rams are exploring trading Stafford. This could be another intriguing option for the Raiders. Stafford, like Rodgers, has had success and could be a viable short-term solution for a team looking to contend now. The main difference is that while Rodgers might be available at a bargain, Stafford would require a new contract, likely in the $40 million per year range, similar to Kirk Cousins' deal with the Falcons. The Rams reportedly want to move Stafford to acquire draft assets. Cowherd mentioned that the Giants are not particularly high on this year's quarterback draft class, which could lead to a Stafford to Giants scenario if they decide to move on from Daniel Jones. But that also means Stafford could be available for the Raiders if they want to explore that route. So, the big question is, what do the Raiders actually want to do? According to Jeremy Fowler of ESPN, multiple league executives believe the Raiders are interested in pursuing a veteran quarterback. He even mentioned Sam Darnold as a potential option, which ties into the broader theme. The Raiders may prefer experience over rolling the dice on a rookie. If the Giants aren't sold on this quarterback class, and the Raiders also feel that way, they might decide that none of the available prospects are worth taking at number 6 overall. Instead, they could prioritize other positions and go after a veteran like Stafford or Rodgers. If that's the case, the Raiders could draft a developmental quarterback in the 2nd or 3rd round, rather than forcing a pick at number 1. 6. That could be the smarter move in the long run. The truth is, drafting the wrong quarterback too high can set a team back, while drafting the best available player can have a bigger impact in the long run.
They have hired former Incarnate Word offensive coordinator Connor McQueen to be their assistant wide receivers coach. McQueen is quickly rising in the coaching ranks. The former Texas AANDM QB was a graduate assistant just 2 years ago. He spent 5 years as a graduate assistant, first at UCLA under Chip Kelly, then he took the same position under Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, and moved with him to USC. In 2023, at the age of 29, McQueen was named the OC at Incarnate Word, and last year helped lead the school to become the second-ranked offense in the nation at the FCS level. McQueen should offer some valuable insight in the room for the Raiders receivers to help them manipulate defenses, so it's going to be an interesting offseason for the Raiders. Things might be slow for the next few weeks, but once free agency picks up, it's going to get wild. For the first time in a while, the coaching staff seems solid. The roster has pieces in place, and they have real flexibility to shape the future. Whether it's Rodgers, Stafford, or another direction entirely, the Raiders have options. Let me know what you think. Should the Raiders go after Rodgers? Drop your thoughts in the comments.